Hey guys, tonight we're going to take a journey into a world often romanticized, painted with thrilling tales of buried treasure and swashbuckling adventure. But we're going beyond the glittering myths to uncover the awful truth about being a pirate in the Caribbean. Imagine this: you're not on a sleek, pristine ship, but a cramped, reeking wooden coffin, pitching wildly on a churning sea. The air isn't filled with the scent of salty spray and freedom, but with sweat, bilge water, and the pervasive odor of unwashed bodies. Your dashing cutlass is rusty, your clothes are rags, and that charming parrot on your shoulder probably covered in lice. You probably won't survive this, not with all your limbs intact, but we're going to dive into the grim reality anyway. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And if you're feeling adventurous, drop your location and local time in the comments. I always love seeing where you guys are tuning in from. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You've just signed on, or more likely, been pressed into service aboard a pirate vessel in the early 18th century. Perhaps you were a desperate sailor fleeing cruel conditions on a merchant ship, a fisherman kidnapped from your humble boat, or a former privateer who chose the black flag over a hangman's noose. Whatever your reason, you're now part of a pirate crew, and the romantic notions quickly vanish, replaced by a brutal reality: the Caribbean, with its shimmering turquoise waters and lush green islands, might look like paradise from a distance. But up close, it's a crucible of heat, disease, and constant danger. The ship itself is a far cry from the majestic vessels of films. It's often a converted merchant brig or sloop, sturdy enough for raiding but never designed for comfort or long-term living. It smells, oh how it smells, a mixture of stale sweat, unwashed clothing, human waste, spoiled food, and the ever-present dampness of the sea clings to everything. You quickly learn to ignore it, or at least to dull your senses to its pervasive assault. This isn't just unpleasant, it's a constant threat to your health, a breeding ground for sickness. One mainstream historical fact that completely shatters the myth of glamorous pirate life is that the vast majority of pirates' lives were short, brutal, and plagued by disease, poor nutrition, and constant danger, far removed from the romanticized image of adventure and riches. Life expectancy for a pirate was often only a few years, if that from the moment they turned to piracy. Think about that: a career with worse odds than a medieval childbirth. A particularly quirky tidbit that reveals the stark reality of life aboard a pirate ship is the pervasive issue of personal hygiene, or rather, the complete lack thereof. Bathing was infrequent, often limited to a quick rinse during a rainstorm, or a daring dip in the open ocean if sharks weren't a concern, and the captain allowed it. Most crews lived in their clothes for weeks, even months, attracting lice, fleas, and other vermin. Imagine the itching, the constant discomfort, the sheer filth that became a normal part of your daily existence. Historians still argue whether the extreme lack of hygiene was purely due to practical limitations. Freshwater scarcity, lack of understanding of germs, or if there was also a deliberate rejection of civilized norms by men who had often fled harsh. Disciplined naval life, embracing a rougher, freer existence, even if it was dirtier, was it simply unavoidable? Or a deliberate defiance of convention? Your cabin is likely a space shared with dozens of other men in the cramped forecastle, or even on the open deck, exposed to the elements. Hammocks, if you're lucky enough to have one, offer a slight reprieve from sleeping on hard planks. There's no privacy, no personal space, just the constant jostle of bodies, the creak of timber, and the relentless motion of the sea. You quickly learn to sleep through the noise, the swaying, and the pervasive discomfort. The dream of gold and jewels. That's for the songs. The reality is often meager spoils, mundane cargo like sugar, tobacco, cloth, or basic provisions. A small share of this might be yours, after the captain and officers take their cut, and after supplies and repairs are funded, the treasure chest is more likely a barrel of dried biscuits than glittering doubloons. The glorious freedom. It comes with a price. You're constantly looking over your shoulder, not just for the Royal Navy, but for rival pirate crews or even for mutiny from within your own ranks. Trust is a luxury, paranoia a necessity. The Caribbean is beautiful. Yes, but it's a beautiful, brutal stage for a life that is truly, deeply awful, and where every sunrise is a small miracle, a defiance of the odds stacked against you. The moment you step aboard a pirate ship, you enter a world utterly defined by claustrophobia and grime. Forget spacious galleons and tidy decks. Your new home is a floating, wooden prison, and life aboard crowded. Filthy is the grim reality of your everyday existence. Every square inch of the vessel, from the stifling hold to the exposed deck, is a testament to discomfort, lack of privacy, and pervasive filth. A constant assault on your senses and your health. It's like living in a perpetually rocking, unventilated attic filled with dozens of other sweaty, unwashed people and the lingering smell of everything unpleasant. Your living quarters are rudimentary at best. If you're an ordinary crewman, you'll likely share a cramped, unlit space in the forecastle, the forward part of the ship, with dozens of other sailors. Hammocks, a relatively new invention at the time and adopted by sailors for their ability to sway with the ship's motion, are a luxury. More often, you're simply finding a spot on the hard, often damp wooden decks, jostling for space, or slinging a crude bedroll. There's no concept of a private cabin for the ordinary seaman. Even officers might share bunks or small, barely partitioned spaces. One mainstream historical fact that highlights this grim reality is that pirate ships were notoriously overcrowded, with crews living in extremely cramped and unsanitary conditions, leading to rapid spread of disease and constant discomfort, far removed from any notion of spacious, romantic seafaring. These conditions were a breeding ground for illness and a constant source of misery. The air below deck is thick and stagnant, a noxious mixture of unwashed bodies. The acrid smell of bilge water, a cocktail of seawater, oil, and whatever else seeped into the ship's lowest reaches. The lingering odor of unemptied chamber pots, and the pervasive scent of damp, decaying wood. Ventilation is poor to non-existent, especially in rough weather when hatches are battened down. You quickly learn to breathe shallowly, to try and numb your sense of smell, or else be constantly on the verge of nausea. A particularly quirky tidbit that further emphasizes the filth is the constant battle against vermin. Rats, mice, cockroaches, and especially lice and fleas were ubiquitous companions. Your clothes, likely worn for weeks or months without proper washing. Remember that bit about hygiene. Become a haven for these tiny, biting creatures. You'll spend countless hours scratching, trying to pick lice from your hair and beard, a relentless losing battle against an unseen enemy. Imagine the itching, the constant irritation, never truly clean, never truly free from the feeling of things crawling on you. Historians still argue whether the extreme levels of infestation on pirate ships were simply an unavoidable consequence of limited resources and primitive hygiene understanding, or if the deliberate rejection of societal norms by pirates meant they actively embraced a more animalistic existence, making no effort to combat vermin, viewing it as part of their rough-and-tumble life. Was it merely practical or a defiant choice? Water, a precious commodity, is carefully rationed and often brackish or slimy after weeks in wooden casks. You drink it anyway, because there's no alternative, trying to ignore the taste and the knowledge that it's likely teeming with unseen life. Bathing, as we touched on before, is a rare luxury, often only during a downpour, when you might strip off your clothes and try to rinse away some of the accumulated filth. Otherwise, why, you're just living in your own accumulating dirt. Beyond your personal space, the ship's common areas are equally squalid. The galley, where meals are prepared, is greasy and fly-infested. The deck, while open to the air, is often littered with detritus from daily life, not to mention the remains of captured cargo or remnants of combat. Blood, grime, and seawater mix, making for slippery, unstable footing. The cramped conditions also meant a complete lack of privacy. Every aspect of your life, from eating to sleeping to tending to bodily functions, is performed in close proximity to dozens of other men. There's nowhere to retreat, nowhere to be truly alone. Arguments over space, over meager possessions, or simply from frayed nerves are common, often erupting into violence. You hear the constant creak of the ship's timbers, the slap of waves against the hull, the groans of the mast. These sounds, combined with the pervasive stench and the constant physical discomfort, form the symphony of your new life. It's a relentless assault on your senses, reminding you that the romantic image of the pirate is a cruel joke. The reality is a life of crowded, filthy endurance, where every day is a test of your tolerance for discomfort and your ability to simply exist in a floating, reeking prison. Even if you could somehow ignore the cramped, filthy conditions aboard a pirate ship. The next, and perhaps most relentless, adversary you'd face was the struggle against diet and disease scurvy's scourge. Far from the feasts of fictional pirates, your meals were monotonous, often spoiled, and woefully lacking in essential nutrients. This terrible diet, combined with the unsanitary living conditions, created a fertile breeding ground for a host of debilitating and often fatal illnesses, making disease, not combat, the most prolific killer of pirates. It's like being forced to run a marathon on a diet of stale crackers and stagnant water, knowing that your body is slowly failing you from the inside out. Your typical meal would consist of hardtack, a brick-hard biscuit made from flour and water, often infested with weevils, salted beef or pork, often rancid and tougher than shoe leather, and a limited supply of dried peas or beans. Fresh food, especially fruits and vegetables, was a rare and fleeting luxury, only available during brief stops ashore, and even then, often quickly consumed. One mainstream historical fact that utterly devastates the romantic pirate image is that scurvy, a debilitating disease caused by vitamin C deficiency, was rampant among pirate crews, leading to symptoms like bleeding gums, joint pain, open sores, and ultimately death, alongside other common diseases like dysentery, fevers, and venereal infections. Life aboard a pirate ship was a constant battle against malnutrition and illness. Imagine trying to chew through a piece of salted meat that has been preserved for months. Tasting faintly of brine and decay, your teeth, if you still have them, would ache from the effort. Your gums might already be swollen and bleeding, a telltale sign of the dreaded scurvy creeping into your body. A particularly quirky tidbit about scurvy is that while the cure citrus fruits was known to some mariners for centuries, the underlying reason it worked vitamin C deficiency wasn't understood until much later. Leading to inconsistent application of the remedy, imagine having the cure within reach, but only some knowing how to reliably wield it, while others dismissed it as mere superstition. Historians still argue whether the high mortality rates from scurvy and other diseases among pirate crews were primarily due to genuine ignorance of effective preventative measures, or if the logistical challenges of preserving fresh produce on long voyages simply made consistent prevention impossible, regardless of knowledge. Was it a lack of understanding or a lack of practical means? Beyond scurvy, you'd face a litany of other terrifying ailments. Dysentery, often caused by contaminated water or food, would rip through the crew, leading to agonizing dehydration and death. Fevers, from malaria, especially in the Caribbean climate, to unknown bacterial infections, would leave men delirious and weak. Venereal diseases, contracted during drunken shore leaves, were rampant, leading to chronic suffering and disfigurement. There were no antibiotics, no understanding of germ theory, and no effective treatments for most of these conditions. Your immune system was your only defense, and it was constantly under siege. Medical care aboard a pirate ship was To put it mildly, rudimentary. The ship's surgeon was often just another crewman with some basic knowledge of first aid, or perhaps a former barber with limited training. Their tools were crude, their understanding of anatomy even cruder, and their only real remedies were rudimentary painkillers, purges, or the desperate final resort of amputation. We'll get more into that later, but just know, for now, that a visit to the surgeon was often as terrifying as the disease itself. The constant damp, the lack of fresh air, the poor sanitation, and the relentless physical exertion all combine to weaken your body, making you more susceptible to every passing illness. You'd see crewmates succumb one by one, their bodies often simply sewn into a hammock and slipped silently into the sea. A common, grim end for many a pirate. You feel a persistent ache in your joints, a tenderness in your gums, and a constant, low-grade nausea. These aren't just minor discomforts, they are the insidious creep of disease, slowly, inexorably, weakening your body. The dream of adventure and treasure fades under the brutal reality of chronic hunger and omnipresent sickness. You realize that your greatest foe isn't the Royal Navy or a rival pirate, it's the microscopic invaders within your own body. Nurtured by the awful truth of a pirate's diet and the inescapable filth of life at sea, beyond the ravages of disease and the unending squalor, life as a pirate was defined by another grim reality: brutal discipline captain's rule. Forget romantic notions of democratic pirates. While crews did elect their captains, once chosen, that captain wielded immense, often arbitrary, power. Life aboard was governed by strict, unyielding rules, enforced with a severity that would make a Royal Navy ship seem like a pleasure cruise. You quickly learn that stepping out of line means facing punishments that could be agonizing, disfiguring, or even fatal, all at the whim of the man who holds ultimate authority on this floating kingdom. It's like being a permanent house guest in a very volatile home, where the owner can decide your fate on a whim, and there's nowhere to run. You witness firsthand the swiftness of pirate justice. A minor infraction, perhaps failing to keep your watch, or arguing with an officer, might result in a severe flogging. The whip, a cat o' nine tails, tears into a man's back, each lash a searing ribbon of pain, designed not just to punish, but to terrify the rest of the crew into obedience. The cries of the punished man echo across the deck, a chilling reminder of the captain's absolute power. One mainstream historical fact that utterly contrasts with the image of free-spirited rogues is that pirate ships operated under extremely harsh and often brutal disciplinary codes, with captains wielding significant authority to inflict severe corporal punishments, including flogging, keel hauling, and even death, for infractions ranging from insubordination to theft. The myth of a perfectly democratic pirate crew often ignores the grim reality of maintaining order by force. A particularly quirky tidbit that highlights the dark humor and brutal efficiency of pirate punishment is the practice of sweating the rogue. A disobedient pirate might be confined to a small, dark, suffocating space below deck, sometimes called the sweat box, or forced to run around the mast until they collapsed from exhaustion or heat stroke. Imagine being punished by literally being cooked in a confined space, or forced into a perpetual, dizzying sprint, all while the ship pitches and rolls. Historians still argue whether the extreme brutality of pirate punishments was primarily a direct inheritance from the harsh discipline of legitimate navies which many pirates had fled, or if it was an adaptive strategy developed by pirate captains to maintain control over diverse, often volatile crews who had no formal legal ties to them. Was it a continuation of naval cruelty, or a unique pirate innovation for control? Insubordination, challenging the captain's authority, or attempting mutiny would be met with even more terrifying consequences. You might witness a crewman being tied to a cannon and left exposed to the sun for hours, or having his ears cropped, a disfiguring mark that would follow him for life, signaling his transgression. These punishments were not just about pain, they were about stripping away dignity, branding the individual as a troublemaker, and instilling absolute fear in others. The captain's rule wasn't entirely arbitrary, however. Many pirate crews operated under a pirate code or articles, a written or unwritten agreement that outlined rules for behavior, division of spoils, and, crucially, punishments. While the captain was the ultimate authority, these codes sometimes allowed for a vote on certain matters, or for crewmen to have a say in particularly egregious cases of injustice. But even within these codes, the punishments were invariably brutal. For theft from a shipmate, and for instance, a common punishment was being marooned, a fate we'll delve into later, which was essentially a slow, agonizing death sentence. The constant threat of punishment fostered a climate of fear, but also a strange kind of solidarity. Crewmates might grumble amongst themselves, but open defiance was rare, as the consequences were so severe. You learn to keep your head down, to follow orders, and to never ever cross the captain. His word is law, and his temper, often fueled by rum and the pressures of command, is a terrifying force. You hear the shouts of the captain, his voice carrying over the waves, sharp and unyielding. You watch as a crewmate, caught pilfering from the communal stores, is brought before him, his face pale with dread. You know what's coming. The whip cracks. The man cries out, and a new layer of fear settles over the ship. In the awful truth of being a pirate, freedom was often a cruel illusion, replaced by the iron fist of the captain's rule, where every transgression was met with a brutal, unforgettable lesson, ensuring that everyone understood who truly commanded the vessel. Beyond the internal horrors of shipboard life and captain's rule, the very essence of piracy lay in its violent encounters. Combat's chaos. Violent encounters wasn't the cinematic dance of swords on a sunny deck. It was a brutal, terrifying, and often very quick explosion of noise, smoke, and unimaginable savagery. When two ships engaged, the ensuing chaos was absolute, with lives snuffed out in an instant and injuries that defied description. You quickly learn that survival in these moments depends on a blend of luck, desperation, and an instinct for self-preservation that overrides all other senses. It's like being caught in a confined space during a stampede, but with cannonballs, muskets, and razor-sharp steel flying everywhere. You feel the ship lurch as a lookout shouts, "Sail ho!" The excitement, or more accurately, the surge of adrenaline and fear, courses through the crew. The pirate ship, often smaller and faster than the merchant vessel it hunts, maneuvers for position. The tension is palpable as cannons are readied, muskets loaded, and cutlasses drawn. There's a strange, almost surreal calm before the storm, broken only by the creak of the ship and the nervous whispers of your crewmates. One mainstream historical fact that dismantles the romanticized notion of pirate combat is that naval engagements in the Age of Sail, including those involving pirates, were intensely chaotic, noisy, and brutally violent affairs, relying on devastating broadsides from cannons followed by close-quarters boarding actions where hand-to-hand combat was bloody and high risk. The objective was often to disable the enemy ship and capture its cargo and crew, rather than to sink it outright. Then, the roar. Your ship's cannons unleash their broadside, sending massive cannonballs smashing into the enemy's hull, splintering wood, tearing through rigging, and often ripping apart anyone in their path. The air fills with thick, acrid gunpowder smoke, stinging your eyes and choking your lungs. You hear the screams of the injured from the other vessel, a chilling prelude to what awaits you. A particularly quirky tidbit about cannon fire is that pirates often used grape shot or chain shot, bags filled with musket balls or two cannonballs chained together. These weren't designed to sink a ship but to shred sails, rigging, and, most horrifically, any men on deck, preparing the way for boarding. Imagine a shotgun blast, but on a massive ship-destroying scale. Historians still argue whether the primary reason pirates preferred boarding over simply sinking a ship was purely economic to preserve the valuable cargo, or if there was also a psychological element where the terror of being overwhelmed by a boarding party encouraged quicker surrender from merchant crews, reducing the risk of a prolonged fight for the pirates. Was it about profit or psychological warfare? As the smoke momentarily clears, your ship grinds alongside the enemy vessel. Grapples are thrown, and the order to board rings out. This is where the true terror begins. You scramble across, cutlass in hand, your heart pounding. The deck of the enemy ship is a chaotic scene of close-quarters combat. Muskets fire at point-blank range, their flash momentarily blinding. Swords clang, axes hack, and pistols bark. There's no finesse, no polite dueling. It's a desperate, brutal brawl. You might see a man fall, clutching a gaping wound, his lifeblood staining the deck. You might trip over a severed limb or slip on a puddle of blood. The objective isn't always to kill everyone. Sometimes, it's simply to terrorize, to overwhelm, to force a quick surrender. But in the heat of battle, that distinction is often lost. The noise is deafening shouts, screams, the crack of pistols, the thud of bodies, the constant creak and groan of the ships. Your senses are overwhelmed, your actions driven by instinct. You find yourself in a desperate dance of death, parrying a blow, thrusting your cutlass, your own survival hanging by a thread. The deck becomes slick with blood and seawater, making every movement perilous. The fight might last only minutes, but those minutes stretch into an eternity of terror and violence. When the enemy finally surrenders, or is overwhelmed, the chaos subsides, replaced by the grim aftermath. The decks are strewn with dead and wounded, both friend and foe. The rigging is shot to pieces, the sails riddled with holes. The once proud merchant ship is now a shattered hulk, its crew terrified and defeated, and you still breathing. Perhaps with a new cut or bruise, realize that the reality of combat is far more gruesome, far more visceral than any tale spun in a tavern. This is the awful truth of a pirate's engagement, a terrifying maelstrom of noise, blood, and a desperate fight for survival where glory is an illusion, and the only prize is still being alive. If you were lucky enough to survive the initial, brutal chaos of combat, a new, more agonizing reality quickly presented itself. Wounds and amputations, no mercy. In the cramped, filthy confines of a pirate ship, with no understanding of hygiene or advanced medical techniques, even a minor cut could become a death sentence. And severe injuries almost certainly meant a crude, agonizing procedure that often ended in disfigurement or a slow, painful demise. You quickly learn that a clean fight is a fantasy, and that the greatest danger after a battle isn't a sword, but the infection that crawls unseen. It's like breaking your leg in the middle of a medieval battlefield and knowing your only doctor has a rusty saw and a bottle of cheap rum. You lie on the deck, perhaps with a musket ball lodged in your leg, or a gaping cut from a cutlass. The ship's surgeon remember that crocodile dung sunscreen, or the ancient Pompeians unknowingly poisoning themselves with lead pipes. The medical knowledge here isn't much better, is likely a former barber or a self-taught sailor with a strong stomach and a handful of crude tools. His instruments are basic: a bone saw, a few knives, needles made of iron, and perhaps some linen strips for bandages. Sterilization. That's a concept centuries away. His hands, though perhaps calloused from other labors, are far from clean. One mainstream historical fact that strips away any romantic notion of battlefield medicine is that medical care on pirate ships was rudimentary and horrific, often limited to crude amputations performed without anesthesia or sterile conditions, leading to widespread infection, gangrene, and high mortality rates even from non-fatal wounds. A severe injury was often a precursor to death. Imagine the agonizing pain. There's no modern anesthesia, no morphine, just a swig of rum or brandy, if you're lucky, to dull the edges of consciousness. You're held down by fellow crewmates, your screams swallowed by the vastness of the ocean, or the ongoing chaos of the ship. A particularly quirky tidbit is that a ship's surgeon would sometimes try to cauterize wounds with a hot iron, hoping to stop the bleeding and, unknowingly, to kill some of the lurking bacteria. Imagine a red-hot iron pressed against your open wound, the smell of burning flesh filling your nostrils. Historians still argue whether the extreme reliance on amputation for limb injuries, despite its severity, might have been a pragmatic, albeit desperate, measure to prevent the rapid spread of gangrene in unsanitary conditions, or if it was often a premature resort due to a complete lack of understanding of less invasive wound management. Was it a necessary evil or an overused, brutal solution? If your limb is shattered by a cannonball or irreparably damaged, the decision is swift amputation. The surgeon might place a leather strap in your mouth for you to bite down on, or simply tell you to clench your teeth. With a few swift, horrifying cuts and the agonizing sound of bone being sawed, your limb is removed. The stumps would then be cauterized. Remember that hot iron to stop the bleeding. And, crudely bandaged, infection, or gangrene, often set in rapidly, turning the remaining limb black and putrid, leading to a slow, feverish death. Many who survived the initial trauma of amputation died within days or weeks from infection. Even less severe wounds were dangerous. A simple cut from a rusty cutlass could introduce tetanus. A musket ball, if not extracted cleanly, could lead to festering abscesses. The constant damp and filth of the ship provided a perfect environment for bacteria to thrive. You'd see men with festering sores, limbs swollen and discolored, their lives slowly ebbing away, often begging for death to release them from their agony. For those who did survive such injuries, disfigurement was common. A missing eye? A lost hand? A peg leg? These were not romantic badges of honor, but grim, painful realities that hampered your ability to work, to fight, and to live a normal life. You might become a burden to the crew, perhaps eventually set ashore, or even accidentally fall overboard if you became too much of a liability. You feel a phantom ache in your own limbs, imagining the crude brutality of such medical interventions. The romantic image of the eye-patch-wearing pirate or the peg-legged buccaneer suddenly takes on a much darker, more painful hue. The awful truth of being a pirate wasn't just about the dangers of the sea or the gallows, it was about the constant, agonizing threat of illness and injury, and the brutal, often fatal, lack of mercy in an era when medical science was truly, terrifyingly primitive. Your greatest fear wasn't walking the plank, it was the surgeon's saw. Even if you survived the bloodied chaos of battle and the horrors of the surgeon's saw, life as a pirate was a constant, exhausting game of cat and mouse. You were eternally hunted, never truly safe, living under the omnipresent threat of capture, trial, and the gallows. This was the hunted life constant fear, a grim reality that utterly eclipsed any fleeting moments of freedom or fleeting riches. Every distant sail on the horizon, every unfamiliar port, every shadow could mean the end of your outlaw existence. It's like being a perpetual fugitive, always looking over your shoulder, knowing that the most powerful navies in the world are constantly searching for you. You sail the vast, shimmering waters of the Caribbean, a place of breathtaking beauty that, for you, is also a vast, unforgiving hunting ground. The major European powers, England, France, Spain, and the Netherlands, had vast colonial interests in the region, and piracy was a direct threat to their lucrative trade routes. They employed every resource at their disposal to eradicate it. One mainstream historical fact that underscores this relentless pursuit is that the major European navies, particularly the British Royal Navy, actively hunted pirates in the Caribbean through dedicated patrols, the commissioning of privateers, and the establishment of fortified naval bases, leading to a high rate of capture and execution for those who chose a life of piracy. The golden age of piracy was ultimately a very short-lived phenomenon, crushed by state power. Imagine the tension on watch. Hours spent scanning the horizon. your eyes aching from the sun and glare, searching for the telltale sails of a man of war. The sighting of a square-rigged warship, often heavily armed, would send a cold dread through the crew, signaling a desperate chase or an impossible fight. A particularly quirky tidbit that reveals the lengths pirates went to avoid capture is their use of shallow-drafted vessels. Pirates often preferred sloops and schooners that could navigate into shallow coves and inlets where larger, deeper-drafted naval frigates couldn't follow. Imagine trying to escape a battleship by sailing your little fishing boat into a muddy creek. Historians still argue whether the Royal Navy's adoption of more organized and persistent anti-piracy campaigns, coupled with offering pardons to pirates who surrendered, was primarily responsible for the rapid decline of piracy in the Caribbean, or if internal factors within pirate communities, such as increasing infighting and diminishing returns from plunder, also contributed significantly to their demise. Was it external pressure or internal decay? The concept of a safe haven was largely an illusion. While notorious pirate strongholds like Port Royal before its destruction or Nassau provided temporary respite, they were always under threat of naval assault or political shifts that could turn allies into enemies overnight. You might spend your loot in a raucous tavern, knowing that at any moment a sudden raid by soldiers or privateers could end your freedom. Trust, as we've mentioned, was a luxury. Privateers, often former pirates themselves, or desperate sailors commissioned by colonial governors, added another layer of danger. These were essentially government-sanctioned pirates, given letters of marque to prey on enemy shipping, but they often blurred the lines and preyed on whoever was weakest. You never knew if that distant sail was a fellow rogue or a sanctioned hunter, just as ruthless as you. But with the backing of a king, the chase itself was a terrifying ordeal. Days, even weeks, that could be spent sailing at top speed, pushing the ship and crew to their limits, knowing that if caught, the consequences were dire. You'd sacrifice cargo, jettison cannons, do anything to lighten the ship and gain an inch of speed. The exhaustion, the fear, the constant vigilance would wear you down, turning your life into a never-ending flight. The fear of capture extended beyond the sea, even ashore in seemingly friendly ports. The threat of spies, bounty hunters, or sudden betrayal loomed. You might change your name, adopt disguises, or keep a low profile, but your notoriety or simply your presence could betray you. The skull and crossbones, romantic in legend, was a terrifying beacon in reality, marking you as an enemy of all nations, a target for every naval captain and colonial governor. You feel the persistent gnawing of anxiety, a constant companion that overshadows any fleeting joys. Every gust of wind, every distant cannon shot, every new face in a tavern sends a jolt of fear through your heart. The awful truth of being a pirate wasn't just about the violence you inflicted. It was about the constant, overwhelming fear of being hunted, cornered, and brought to a brutal end. A grim reality that made every sunrise a defiant act of continued existence. Despite the constant danger and grinding squalor, the ultimate allure of piracy, at least for some, was the promise of riches. Yet, the awful truth about being a pirate often revealed a stark reality about shared loot, often meager. Forget chests overflowing with gold and jewels. The average pirate's share of plunder was far less glamorous, more often consisting of basic necessities and modest sums, barely enough to compensate for the immense risks involved. You quickly learn that the tales of vast treasure hoards are just that, tales, spun by storytellers, not the grim reality of life on the high seas. It's like joining a get-rich-quick scheme, only to find out the riches are mostly moldy crackers and worn-out blankets. You participate in the division of spoils after a successful capture. The ship itself, if seaworthy and suitable, might be kept. Its cargo, however, is the real prize. You watch as the crew meticulously goes through the seized goods. One mainstream historical fact that dismantles the image of instant wealth is that the vast majority of pirate plunder consisted of mundane, perishable goods like food, liquor, textiles, and basic supplies, rather than vast quantities of gold. silver, or jewels, which were rare and often already secured by the time a merchant ship was captured. The actual treasure was often far less exciting than legend suggests. Imagine sifting through barrels of sugar, bales of tobacco, bolts of plain cloth, or casks of rum. These are the typical contents of a captured merchant vessel, the workhorses of colonial trade, while valuable for consumption or for trading in certain ports. They aren't the gleaming doubloons and emeralds that fill children's stories. A particularly quirky tidbit is the strict rules pirates often had for dividing their spoils. Many pirate codes stipulated that injured crew members would receive extra shares or specific compensation for lost limbs, ensuring a rudimentary form of social security in a brutal world. Imagine a pension plan based entirely on how many body parts you lose in battle. Historians still argue whether the pirate practice of dividing loot relatively equally after the captain's and officers' shares was a genuine manifestation of their egalitarian ideals and a rejection of traditional naval hierarchy, or if it was primarily a pragmatic necessity to maintain crew morale and prevent mutiny in a highly volatile environment. Was it about fairness or simply stability? The captain and officers, of course, would receive larger shares, perhaps 2 or 3 times that of an ordinary crewman, reflecting their greater responsibility and the risks they took. After repairs to the ship, the cost of provisions, and the captain's cut, your individual share might amount to only a handful of silver coins, some bolts of cloth, and a few extra rations of rum or salted meat. It's enough to survive, perhaps to have a drunken spree on shore, but certainly not enough to retire on, unless you were incredibly, impossibly lucky. The reality of these meager spoils meant that pirates had to be constantly active, constantly raiding just to maintain their subsistence. One successful capture might sustain the crew for a few weeks or months, but then the cycle of hunting and raiding had to begin anew. This constant need for fresh plunder added to the relentless pressure and danger of the pirate's life. There was no comfortable and stable income. Every meal, every drink had to be violently acquired. Even when significant gold or silver was captured, it rarely lasted long. Pirates, having lived lives of deprivation and constant fear, often squandered their newfound wealth on extravagant shore leaves, gambling, or drinking themselves into oblivion. The idea of saving for a comfortable retirement was often alien to men who lived with the knowledge that tomorrow was never guaranteed. You watch as the shared loot is finally divided, your portion small but tangible. You hold the few coins in your hand, feeling their weight, a paltry sum for the dangers you've faced and the horrors you've witnessed. The dream of hidden treasure, of living a life of leisure, fades under the brutal reality of these meager, hard-won gains. The awful truth of being a pirate wasn't about endless riches. It was about the fleeting nature of wealth, the constant grind for survival, and the sobering understanding that for most, the only real treasure was simply staying alive, one meager share at a time. After weeks or months of enduring the crowded, filthy confines of a pirate ship, subsisting on meager rations and facing constant danger, the allure of land, of any port, becomes almost unbearable. This is the fleeting, often ruinous reality of shore leave debauchery and danger. It's a brief, explosive release of pent-up tension, a mad scramble for pleasure and oblivion, often ending in violence, disease, or the depletion of your meager earnings. You rush ashore, desperate for any sensation that isn't the rocking of the ship, only to find yourself stepping into a different kind of peril. It's like being released from a small, dark cage into a vast, brightly lit one, where the temptations are endless and the hidden traps are everywhere. You hit the docks with your shipmates, the ground feeling strangely stable beneath your feet after so long at sea. The sounds and smells of the port town, the chatter of vendors, the aroma of cooked food, the laughter and music spilling from taverns are an intoxicating assault on your senses. Your pockets might hold a few coins from the last division of spoils, a paltry sum to a wealthy merchant, but a fortune to a man who has lived on hardtack. One mainstream historical fact that completely punctures the romantic notion of pirates carousing freely is that pirate shore leave was often a brief, intense period of excessive drinking, gambling, and visiting brothels, quickly depleting meager earnings and leaving pirates vulnerable to disease. Brawls and betrayal. These periods of rest were often as dangerous, if not more so, than life at sea. Your first stop is invariably a tavern, its doors always open to men with coin and a thirst. The rum flows freely, cheap and potent, burning its way down your throat and quickly dulling the aches and anxieties of ship life. You drink, and you drink, and you drink some more, trying to forget the smell of bilge water, the screams of the dying, the constant gnawing fear. A particularly quirky tidbit about pirate drinking habits is the widespread consumption of grog, a mixture of rum, water, and sometimes lemon or lime juice, the latter unknowingly preventing scurvy. Remember that. While grog was later standardized in the Royal Navy, pirates often concocted their own versions, often dangerously strong. Imagine using a potent, cheap liquor as your primary form of social lubrication and pain relief, knowing full well it would lead to ruinous hangovers and clouded judgment. Historians still argue whether the extreme levels of drinking during pirate shore leave were primarily a cultural norm of the era's seafaring life, exacerbated by the availability of cheap rum, or if it was a desperate psychological coping mechanism for the immense stress, trauma, and constant fear associated with a life of piracy. Was it simply how sailors behaved, or a form of self-medication? The gambling dens, often in the back rooms of these very taverns, beckon with the clatter of dice and the promise of quick riches. You might throw your hard-won coins onto a table, hoping to turn your modest share into a fortune, only to lose it all in a few frantic rolls. The thrill of the gamble is intoxicating, a brief illusion of control in a life where control is almost non-existent. And then there are the brothels, or the women who ply their trade in the taverns and on the streets. After months at sea, deprived of female company, these encounters are crude, quick, and often carry the risk of venereal diseases, which were rampant and incurable. You seek a fleeting moment of physical comfort, only to potentially invite long-term suffering. The dangers ashore are many. Brawls easily erupt, fueled by rum and frayed tempers, often ending with knives drawn or bottles smashed. You could be robbed, either by other pirates or by opportunistic locals. You might be drugged and press-ganged onto another ship, or betrayed to the authorities for a bounty. The very freedom you sought ashore becomes a trap, a temporary reprieve that often leads to more trouble than it's worth. Your money, earned at such great risk, disappears with astonishing speed. Before you know it, your pockets are empty, your head is pounding, and the ship's whistle, signaling your return to the cramped, filthy confines. Sounds like a death knell. You drag yourself back aboard, perhaps with a new tattoo, a new scar, or a new, nagging cough, but certainly with a lighter purse and a heavy heart. The brief taste of debauchery has come at a steep price, leaving you no richer and perhaps even sicker than when you arrived. This is the awful truth of a pirate's shore leave, a violent, drunken dash for pleasure that serves only to underscore the misery of the life you've chosen. Even amidst the shared hardships and dangers, life as a pirate was never truly free from betrayal. The Jolly Roger meant to strike fear in the hearts of merchants, sometimes masked a more insidious threat, the Black Flag's betrayal. You quickly learn that loyalty among rogues is a fragile commodity, and that even those who sail under the same skull and crossbones can turn on each other for greed, power, or mere survival. Making trust a dangerous luxury on the high seas? It's like being part of a team, but knowing that at any moment, your teammates might just as easily stab you in the back as fight by your side. You experience the chilling reality when rumors of dissent begin to spread through your own crew. Perhaps the loot has been too meager, the captain too cruel, or the risks too high. Whispers of mutiny, a terrifying undercurrent on any pirate ship, grow louder. This isn't the romanticized rebellion of a downtrodden crew. It's a brutal power struggle, often ending in bloodshed. One mainstream historical fact that utterly punctures the romantic notion of pirate camaraderie is that mutiny was a constant threat on pirate ships, with crews often overthrowing or abandoning captains deemed incompetent, overly tyrannical, or simply unlucky, demonstrating that loyalty was conditional and often ended in violence or desertion. The very structure that offered a semblance of order could be violently undone from within. Imagine the tension as the discontent escalates. Men gather in hushed groups, their glances furtive, their hands never far from their pistols or cutlasses. You find yourself carefully choosing sides, or trying to remain neutral, knowing that making the wrong choice could mean a swift death, either by the hand of an angry captain or a vengeful mutineer. A particularly quirky tidbit is that pirate articles, their unwritten or written codes, sometimes included clauses for electing and deposing captains, providing a semi-legitimate framework for mutiny, effectively formalizing the process of betrayal. Imagine having a legal pathway for overthrowing your boss, but one that still involves swords and pistols. Historians still argue whether the frequency of mutiny on pirate ships indicates a truly egalitarian spirit among pirates, where authority was genuinely challenged from below, or if it merely reflects the inherent instability of a criminal enterprise reliant on fragile agreements and the constant threat of force. Making any leadership position precarious? Was it democracy? Or just chaos? Beyond internal strife, betrayal could come from external sources wearing a similar flag. You might encounter another pirate crew, ostensibly allies, or at least fellow rogues, but trust them at your peril. They might agree to share information about shipping lanes, or even cooperate on a raid, but the moment vulnerabilities appear, or the chance for greater spoils presents itself, the alliance could shatter. Pirates often preyed on other pirates, especially if one ship was weaker or carried valuable plunder. It's a ruthless world where even shared lawlessness doesn't guarantee loyalty. You might be sailing alongside another pirate ship, sharing stories and rum over a few days, only to wake one morning to find them gone, having slipped away in the night with a portion of the shared loot, or worse, having deliberately led you into a trap laid by the Navy. The Jolly Roger, meant to be a symbol of shared rebellion against authority, could become a sign of treachery among its own adherents. This constant threat of betrayal fostered a deep-seated paranoia. You learn to trust no one completely, to always keep one eye open, even among your own crew. Friendships are fleeting, alliances fragile. The only true constant is the pursuit of plunder and the avoidance of capture. This environment of distrust meant that pirate crews, for all their shared struggles, were often incredibly isolated units, unable to truly rely on others in their profession. You feel the cold knot of suspicion in your gut as you watch a group of crewmates huddle conspiratorially in the shadows. You hear the whispers, the muttered complaints, and you know that the winds of discontent are stirring. The awful truth of being a pirate wasn't just about the dangers from the outside world. It was about the insidious rot of distrust from within. The constant possibility that the very men you fought alongside, those who shared your stolen bread and watered rum, could just as easily betray you, leaving you to face the gallows or the vast, unforgiving sea alone. The black flag, meant to unite, could also mask the deepest, most chilling betrayals. Should you, as a pirate, truly fall out of favor with your crew or captain, or commit an unforgivable transgression against the pirate code, there was a punishment far more terrifying and psychologically brutal than the lash-marooning desperate end. This wasn't a quick death, but a slow, agonizing descent into despair, a deliberate abandonment designed to leave you with nothing but the vast, indifferent sea and the scorching sun as your companions, turning a dream of island paradise into a living nightmare. It's like being dropped into a silent, beautiful painting that slowly, relentlessly, tries to kill you. You stand on the deck, your heart pounding, as the captain pronounces your fate. You've been found guilty perhaps of stealing from the common stock, or deserting in battle, or some other egregious violation of the pirate code. Instead of the gallows, a grim alternative awaits. You're rowed ashore to a tiny, uninhabited island, often a mere sandbar or a patch of rock with a few scraggly palm trees, shimmering under the relentless Caribbean sun. One mainstream historical fact that highlights the brutal finality of this punishment is that marooning, the practice of abandoning a person on a remote, uninhabited island with little or no supplies, was a common and terrifying pirate punishment, almost always resulting in a slow death from starvation, thirst, or exposure. It was a death sentence delivered by nature itself, a chilling testament to pirate justice. Imagine being left with just a musket, a small quantity of powder and shot, often just enough for a few attempts at hunting, or, more chillingly, for a final desperate act against yourself, and a single bottle of water or rum. Your ship, your former comrades, their black flag flapping defiantly, sail away, shrinking to a speck on the horizon, leaving you utterly alone. The silence that descends is deafening, broken only by the lapping of waves and the cry of seabirds. This sudden, profound isolation, after the constant companionship of ship life, is a torment in itself. A particularly quirky tidbit related to marooning is the morbid humor sometimes displayed by the pirates carrying out the punishment. They might offer a sarcastic farewell or a theatrical wave as they depart, knowing they are leaving you to an agonizing fate. Imagine your tormentors waving goodbye as they condemn you to death. Historians still argue whether the psychological impact of marooning, by emphasizing extreme isolation and the slow, inevitable approach of death, was a more effective deterrent for pirate crews than a swift execution, or if it was simply a more convenient way for captains to dispose of unwanted crew members without the mess and public spectacle of a hanging. Was it a calculated psychological weapon, or a pragmatic disposal method? The days bleed into each other, marked only by the brutal rhythm of the sun and the gnawing pangs of hunger and thirst. The single bottle of water or rum is quickly depleted. You search frantically for fresh water, digging in the sand, hoping for a hidden spring, knowing that without it, your time is desperately short. The musket, your only tool, might prove useless. Hunting for food on a barren island is a futile endeavor. The sun beats down relentlessly, quickly dehydrating you, turning your skin raw. Nights are cold and filled with the terrifying sounds of unseen creatures, or perhaps just the amplified whispers of your own growing madness. Despair becomes your constant companion. You might try to signal passing ships, lighting desperate fires or waving frantically, but most ships, especially those of the Royal Navy, would be wary of approaching an unknown island, fearing a pirate trap. The agonizing irony of marooning is that it's a death without a witness, a fading into nothingness. There's no heroic last stand, no grand farewell, just the slow, humiliating decay of your body and mind, abandoned to the elements. You might scribble a desperate message in the sand, or carve your name into a palm tree, a last futile attempt to leave a mark, to prove you existed. You feel the parched dryness in your throat, the aching emptiness in your stomach, and the growing delirium as the days stretch on. The beautiful turquoise water, once inviting, now mocks you with its inaccessibility. The swaying palm trees offer no shade from the brutal sun. The awful truth of being a pirate wasn't just about being caught by the Navy. It was about the chilling, internal terror of being cast off by your own kind, left to a desperate, solitary end, far from any hope of rescue or even a proper burial. Even if you somehow managed to escape the brutal internal justice of your pirate crew, the chilling reality for any pirate was the ever-present shadow of the legitimate authorities. If caught, your life would quickly conclude in the most public and unforgiving manner, trial and hanging grim justice. This wasn't a private affair. It was a carefully orchestrated spectacle designed to instill fear, assert state power, and serve as a stark warning against a life of outlawry. You quickly learn that the freedom of the high seas ends abruptly at the end of a rope, and that the only treasure waiting for you is a very public, very final curtain call. It's like arriving at the end of a thrilling, dangerous game, only to discover the prize is a noose. You hear the shout of, "Sail ho!" But this time, it's not a merchant vessel, it's a heavily armed man of war, flying the colors of the Royal Navy or a Spanish galleon. The chase is futile. You're outnumbered, outgunned, and swiftly overwhelmed. The feeling of cold steel against your neck, the rough hands binding your wrists, signals the end of your pirating days. You're swiftly transported to a colonial port, perhaps Port Royal in Jamaica or Charleston in the Carolinas, a place that once offered fleeting pleasure. Now your grim destination. One mainstream historical fact that dramatically contrasts with the romantic image of pirates is that captured pirates faced swift and severe justice, almost invariably leading to a public trial and execution by hanging, often in large numbers, as colonial authorities sought to deter piracy and assert state control over maritime trade. The justice system was not about rehabilitation. It was about exemplary punishment. Imagine the confinement. You're likely thrown into a dank, overcrowded jail cell, perhaps in a fort or a converted warehouse, awaiting trial. The air is foul, the darkness absolute, and the only company is the desperate whispers of other captured pirates, their stories mirroring your own grim fate. A particularly quirky tidbit that reveals the desperate hope of some pirates is the practice of attempting to plead the king's pardon, or claim they were simply victims of impressment-forced naval service and not willing pirates. While some pardons were indeed offered at various times to encourage pirates to surrender, once caught and accused of specific acts of piracy, such pleas were usually futile. Imagine trying to explain to a stern judge that you were just along for the ride on a ship filled with murderous rogues. Historians still argue whether the spectacle of public executions, by instilling fear and demonstrating state power, was genuinely effective in deterring piracy in the long term, or if the underlying economic conditions and social injustices that drove men to piracy were more significant factors that merely shifted pirate activity rather than truly ending it. Did it stop piracy, or just move it? The trial itself would be a short, brutal affair. There were no elaborate legal defenses for common pirates. You would likely be brought before an admiralty court, often composed of naval officers and colonial officials, already biased against you. Witnesses, often the terrified crew of captured merchant ships, would identify you. Your very presence, and the reputation of pirates, would seal your doom. The verdict was almost a foregone conclusion guilty. Then comes the sentence death by hanging. And it would be public. Crowds would gather, sometimes numbering in the thousands, eager to witness the spectacle. The execution site would be prominent, often at the water's edge, visible to incoming ships. A chilling message delivered to all who plied the seas. You would be paraded through the streets, perhaps in an open cart, bound. Your face a mask of terror or defiance, pelted by insults or prayers from the crowd. The gallows loom large, a simple, stark structure. But its purpose is terrifyingly clear. You would be given a final chance to speak. Perhaps to confess, to offer a last defiant curse, or to beg for mercy that would not come. The rope, rough and unforgiving, is placed around your neck. The trapdoor opens. The fall is quick. The snap of the neck mercifully swifter than the drawn-out agony of marooning. Sometimes, after death, your body might be left hanging in chains. Perhaps in a gibbet, at the entrance to a harbor. A grisly warning to all who passed. This practice, known as gibbeting, ensured that your awful end served as a long-term deterrent. A macabre scarecrow on the high seas. You feel the imagined chill of the rope, the final, terrifying pull, and the sudden wrenching end. The awful truth of being a pirate wasn't just about the dangers of the sea. It was about the almost certain promise of a brutal, public end. A grim spectacle designed to erase your rebellion and reassert the authority of the very powers you defied. Your freedom, once so intoxicating, now dissolves into the grim justice of the gallows. Beyond the cutthroat realities of combat and the ever-present gallows, The awful truth about being a pirate also involved facing the harsh biases of the era, particularly when it came to gender and race-limited ranks. The popular image of the dashing, diverse pirate crew often overlooks the incredibly restrictive social norms and prejudices of the 17th and 18th centuries, meaning that a life of piracy offered very different, often brutal prospects depending on your gender or racial background. You quickly learn that even among outlaws, old world prejudices cast long, undeniable shadows. It's like joining a rebellion against one set of rules, only to find yourself still bound by a different, equally unfair set of unwritten ones. You might have heard tales of legendary female pirates like Anne Bonny and Mary Read, or seen depictions of fierce, independent women in the tales. While these women indeed existed and defied immense societal odds, they were incredibly rare exceptions to the rule. One mainstream historical fact that dismantles the widespread myth of gender equality on pirate ships is that women were overwhelmingly excluded from pirate crews due to deeply ingrained superstitions believing women brought bad luck on ships and societal norms. And those few who did participate often had to disguise their gender to survive. Their presence was an anomaly, not a norm, and came with immense risks. Imagine the sheer difficulty for a woman to even get aboard a pirate ship, let alone stay there. She would likely have to disguise herself as a man, adopting male clothing, cutting her hair short, and speaking in a low voice, living in constant fear of discovery. If her gender was revealed, she could face severe punishment, including death, or be put ashore at the next available port. A particularly quirky tidbit is the historical belief among sailors that a woman on board would cause bad weather or bring ill fortune to the voyage. Imagine the psychological pressure of constantly fearing that your very presence could be blamed for a storm or a lack of plunder. Historians still argue whether the superstitious belief about women on ships was primarily a convenient justification for maintaining an all-male masculine environment, or if it also stemmed from genuine fears about the disruption of social order and sexual dynamics in the close quarters of a ship. Was it practical prejudice, alarming, or deep-seated fear? For people of non-European descent, particularly enslaved Africans who made up a significant portion of the Caribbean population, the awful truth of piracy was even more complex and brutal. While some enslaved individuals did indeed find their way onto pirate crews, either through forced impressment during ship captures or by voluntarily escaping their bondage, their opportunities and treatment were still largely determined by the prevailing racial prejudices. You might see enslaved Africans serving alongside white crewmen, often in menial roles, but sometimes even as skilled navigators or gunners, while some pirate captains, notably Blackbeard, were known to have diverse crews and offer a degree of equality within the piratical structure, often based on skill and willingness to fight. This was not universal. These instances of racial integration, while revolutionary for the time, were still an exception in a world dominated by the transatlantic slave trade. One grim reality is that if a pirate ship was captured, any enslaved Africans on board, whether voluntarily or involuntarily, faced the grim prospect of being returned to slavery. Regardless of their actions as pirates, their freedom with pirates was a temporary, precarious state. You observe the subtle power dynamics. A white European pirate might grumble about a mixed crew, or a newly escaped enslaved person might face extra scrutiny and harsher treatment. The bonds of shared rebellion against authority could sometimes transcend racial lines, but the deep-seated prejudices of the era were never entirely absent. The dream of pirate freedom was, for many, a false promise. For women, it was a life of dangerous disguise and constant fear of discovery. For people of color, it was a precarious gamble, offering a fleeting taste of autonomy that could be brutally revoked at any moment, returning them to the bondage they had sought to escape. You realize that, even under the Black Flag, the Old World's cruel divisions followed you, limiting your choices and shaping your awful truth. The open seas offered a tempting illusion of equality, but the harsh realities of gender and race ensured that even among outlaws, some were more free and more doomed than others. Despite the brutal realities of shipboard life, the constant danger, and the grim punishments. Pirate crews often adhered to a surprisingly strict internal framework. This was the Pirate Code Brutal Order. Far from being lawless anarchists, most pirate crews operated under a set of self-imposed rules, often written down as articles, which governed everything from the division of plunder to disciplinary actions. This code provided a brutal, yet effective form of self-governance, demonstrating a fascinating paradox: outlaws creating their own rigid legal system on the high seas. It's like a criminal gang that has a meticulously written constitution, and they really, really stick to it. You might have been present when these articles were read aloud, perhaps nailed to the mast for all to see. When you first joined the crew, each man would be expected to swear an oath, often on a Bible, even if they weren't particularly pious. The symbolism held weight to uphold these rules. One mainstream historical fact that profoundly challenges the myth of chaotic piracy is that many pirate crews operated under a formalized pirate code, or articles, a written agreement outlining rules for conduct, duties, shares of plunder, and punishments, which served as a form of democratic governance and legal structure on board, fostering a brutal but often egalitarian order. These codes provided a framework for shared risks and rewards. Imagine a set of rules that governs your every action. A particularly quirky tidbit is that these codes often stipulated very specific regulations for the care of weapons, forbidding gambling for money on board, and even setting lights out times. Imagine a band of wild, dangerous pirates being told they have to turn off their lanterns by 8 p.m. Historians still argue whether the pirate code's surprising elements of shared decision-making, like voting on captaincy or major raids, were a genuine reflection of proto-democratic ideals and a reaction against the tyranny of naval discipline, or if they were primarily pragmatic tools adopted by captains to manage and motivate volatile, diverse crews in a dangerous environment, offering just enough freedom to maintain cohesion. Was it revolutionary, or just practical? The articles typically laid out specific punishments for various offenses. Theft from a shipmate, for instance, often led to marooning, a fate we discussed earlier. Desertion in battle might also lead to abandonment, or even immediate death. Fighting aboard the ship, particularly with drawn weapons, was strictly forbidden, as it could destabilize the entire crew. These rules, though harsh, were known to everyone, providing a clear expectation of conduct. The division of plunder was a key component of the code. It stipulated how shares would be allocated, with the captain usually receiving 1.5 or 2 shares, officers slightly more than ordinary seamen, and specific compensation for injuries like a one-eyed man's share for losing an eye, or a peg leg payment for a lost leg. This system, though brutal, often offered better pay and more equitable distribution than merchant or naval service, which was a significant draw for many recruits. Remember that discussion about meager loot? Even a small share was often better than nothing. The code also defined duties. Every man had specific responsibilities, from manning cannons to swabbing decks, and neglecting these duties could lead to severe punishment. It was an organization designed for efficient raiding and survival, relying on the collective effort of its members. While the captain was the ultimate authority, the code sometimes provided for crewmen to vote on certain decisions, such as whether to engage a particularly strong enemy, or to depose a captain who was deemed cowardly or overly tyrannical. This element of direct democracy, while often chaotic and still rooted in a culture of violence, offered a degree of agency to the common pirate that was unthinkable in other maritime services. You feel the weight of these unspoken, yet utterly binding rules. They are the invisible chains that hold the crew together, a grim testament to the fact that even among those who rejected the laws of nations, a need for internal order and structure persisted. The awful truth about being a pirate wasn't just about chaos and anarchy, it was about living under a brutal and self-imposed discipline, a fragile system of collective power, and strict adherence to a code that promised both a share of plunder and the very real threat of a swift, unforgiving punishment. This pirate code, for all its brutality, was the skeleton upon which their fleeting, violent world was built. After navigating the cramped, diseased ships, the brutal discipline, the bloody battles, and the grim realities of pirate justice, you can finally step back and understand the vast chasm between legacy myths versus reality. The romanticized image of the swashbuckling buccaneer, living a life of boundless freedom and endless treasure, utterly collapses under the weight of the historical truth. The awful truth about being a pirate in the Caribbean is far grimmer, more violent, and vastly less glamorous than the stories we tell ourselves. Yet paradoxically, it's this very darkness that makes their enduring legend so compelling. It's like peeling back the layers of a beautiful painting to find a dark, raw, and often horrifying truth underneath, which somehow makes the art even more powerful. You've witnessed the constant threat of scurvy and dysentery, the agony of crude amputations, and the pervasive stench of filth and death. You've seen the meager shares of loot, quickly squandered, and the brief, dangerous shore leaves ending in drunkenness and disease. You've felt the cold dread of being hunted, the paranoia of internal betrayal, and the terrifying finality of marooning or the gallows. One mainstream historical fact that underlines this stark contrast is that the romanticized image of pirates in popular culture often significantly deviates from the grim historical reality. Omitting or downplaying aspects like rampant disease, brutal discipline, short life expectancies, and the harsh socioeconomic conditions that drove many to piracy in the first place. The truth is far more complex and sobering. Imagine the popular notion of a pirate captain, perhaps with a feathered hat and a charismatic grin, leading his loyal crew. The reality, as you've learned, was often a ruthless, pragmatic leader who maintained control through fear and swift, brutal punishment. A particularly quirky tidbit is how figures like Blackbeard, while historically significant, became exaggerated almost immediately into fantastical demonic figures in popular chapbooks and plays, a process of myth-making that began even during their lifetimes. Imagine a fearsome pirate intentionally lighting fuses in his beard to enhance his terrifying image, then having that theatricality amplified into pure monster legend. Historians still argue whether the enduring appeal and romanticization of pirates in popular culture is primarily due to their perceived anti-establishment rebellion and freedom from societal norms, or if it's simply a projection of escapist fantasies onto a historical reality that was far too grim to be palatable without significant sanitization. Is it about freedom, or just a good story? The songs and stories rarely mention the overwhelming boredom of long voyages between raids, the constant dampness, or the agonizing pain of a toothache with no relief. They don't dwell on the social stratification within crews, or the deeply ingrained racism and sexism that permeated even this outlaw society. The glamour of the treasure map, pointing to untold riches, conveniently ignores the fact that most treasure was perishable goods, and buried treasure was an almost entirely fictional concept. Remember that discussion about meager loot? That was the reality? Yet, this dark reality is precisely what makes the pirate legend so powerful. It's the ultimate fantasy of escape from oppressive authority, of living by your own rules, however brutal. The pirate, in myth, represents a primal freedom, a defiance against the constraints of civilization. This yearning for unbridled autonomy, for a life outside the law, resonated deeply then, and continues to resonate now, long after the historical figures have turned to dust. The very short golden age of piracy, lasting roughly from 1650 to 1730, was ultimately a desperate, fleeting response to harsh economic conditions, brutal naval impressment, and the allure of quick though often elusive wealth. It was crushed by concerted efforts from powerful navies, by pardons that bled crews dry, and by the sheer, unsustainable brutality of the life itself. You reflect on your journey through this awful truth. The sun-drenched Caribbean, once a postcard of paradise, now holds the ghosts of countless desperate men and women who chose, or were forced into, a life of violence and uncertainty. The sound of waves against the hull, once romantic, now conjures images of sickness, cramped quarters, and the ever-present gallows. But through it all, there's a strange kind of admiration for the sheer tenacity of these individuals. They chose to live outside the established order, forging their own brutal code and facing incredible odds. Their lives were awful. Yes, but they were lived on their own terms, however fleetingly. And as you consider the powerful grip their myth still holds on our imaginations, you realize that the awful truth about being a pirate is precisely what gives the legend its enduring, terrifying, and utterly captivating power. It's a harsh reminder that true freedom often comes with a very, very steep price. Now, let the waves of the Caribbean gently recede, and the echoes of cannon fire fade into the peaceful quiet of your room. The creak of the ship, the shouts of the captain, the sting of the lash, all are safely in the past. Part of a history that now melts into the calming hum of your fan. You've journeyed through the harsh realities of pirate life. And now, it's time for you to find your own peaceful haven. Let your mind unwind, your muscles relax, and sink into a deep, undisturbed sleep, far from the brutal truths of the high seas.